Two congressmen want the U.S. to speedily review its bilateral relations with South Africa. They're angered by South Africa's decision to take Israel to the International Court of Justice over the war in Gaza. Republican John James and Democrat Jared Moscovich introduced the bipartisan bill, which alleges that contrary to its stated non-alignment principle, South Africa has been siding with what they call malign actors in Africa. It is the second attempt in as many years by the U.S. to railroad Africa. In 2022, its Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act failed to sail through its own Congress. So this week on the program, we unpack the implications for South Africa of this proposed bill and why the U.S. finds itself at loggerheads with South Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, joining me now to discuss the tensions between the United States and South Africa are from Beijing, Zhang Yongpeng, a professor and doctoral advisor, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences; from Baltimore in the United States, Lawrence Freeman, political and economic analyst for Africa; and from Johannesburg, Gustavo de Carvalho, senior researcher, African governance and diplomacy at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Gentlemen, welcome to the program and thank you for joining us in this discussion. I want to get your feel very briefly and first off on the situation as we know it. Two U.S. congressmen have brought before the U.S. Congress a proposed bill seeking to make the U.S. review its bilateral relations with South Africa. And that's because South Africa took Israel to court over its war in Gaza. Let me start off with you, Gustavo. Is this justification enough for the U.S. to review bilateral ties with South Africa?
Thank you very much, Beatrice. And I think we've been seeing for the last couple of years increasing tension between the United States and South Africa, certainly with the bilateral relations of South Africa and Russia and its own response to the conflict in Ukraine, but especially from last year after the October 7 attacks and the response from Israel has really highlighted in South Africa a really important priority for the country when it comes to its support to Palestine. Certainly, I think from the U.S. Congress, we're still going to see a long process now in terms of the Foreign Relations Committee and other institutions within the U.S. Congress. But it would be a very tricky situation in terms of jeopardizing the bilateral relations when it comes, particularly when South Africa has gone through a legal process at the International Court of Justice, that it's very much in line with the idea of a rules-based order internationally.
Lawrence, let me get your view here. Is there a justification to all of this?
There is no real justification. This has been going on for well over a year when the Secretary of State Blinken visited South Africa. The problem is that the U.S., governed by a geopolitical ideology, sees that its only way of surviving is to make sure it's on top of Russia and China, and they're on the bottom. And South Africa has an open policy of working with many different countries and has many different alliances. And the U.S. is very upset, or this geopolitical faction, that South Africa is not completely under their control. And, you know, a year ago, they were working on naval maneuvers with China and Russia, and the U.S. went nuts. So this is unfounded, and it's the wrong policy for the U.S. to continue to put down African countries and other countries that do not obey all the rules of the rules-based international order.
Professor Zhang, let me get your view here.
I think it is absolutely not justified for the U.S. as a power and nation to pass such a law to review the bilateral relations with another country. And historically, this is a very seldom phenomenon. This seldom happened in the history of international politics. So simply the logic behind the United States law reviewing the relations with South Africa is that the South Africa must listen to the U.S. and must submit to the U.S., or the United States will teach South Africa. or will impose sanctions on South Africa. So this is completely innate hegemonic and imperial mentality.
Right. So, Lawrence, I guess many people will be asking, why exactly is America feeling so aggrieved by South Africa taking Israel to the International Court of Justice?
Well, don't forget, South Africa has a very rich history of fighting apartheid. And in many ways, South Africa is the key, one of the leaders of the African continent, a member of the BRICS and other institutions. And when the South Africans now bring up the question of what is going on in Gaza, where you're seeing almost 30,000 Palestinians in Gaza killed, this is not something the U.S. wants. The U.S. has maintained a wrong position, and Biden, by hugging Netanyahu, has made a major mistake. And the U.S. is under great pressure internationally and domestically and the Democratic Party because of this position of supporting Netanyahu. The bill that's being put forth in the House Foreign Relations Committee is a joke. It has nothing to do with political relations. It's all to try to punish South Africa for speaking out.
Gustavo, so take us back, to this whole scenario. Why did South Africa feel the need, to take Israel to the ICJ? Why should this offend America?
We need to understand that while we've seen for a number of years South African foreign policy being at times confusing and not particularly clear in terms of positions, the issue and the support that the country provides to the Palestinian cause is one of the most consistent aspects of our foreign policy in the last 30 years. So to a certain degree, in October and November 2023, when we started seeing the impact of the response of Israel in Gaza, and particularly with the very high number of deaths, that was somehow expected that South Africa would take a strong response in relation to that. But it's also important to notice that for the country is of particular importance in this particular space to also identify mechanisms that still aligns with its own visions around the importance of multilateralism, the importance of the rules-based order, and in that regard, the International Court of Justice felt to be for the South African government as a natural space for starting its claim that there was genocide occurring in Gaza. So in that regard, we need to remember that in January, when the court heard the different positions from Israel and from South Africa, there was an acknowledgement that there was a plausibility for its case, meaning that there was not a frivolous case as very often was presented. And we're still going to see a long space. The question now is to see whether institutions that have been created by the international community to uphold international law will be able to do its work without interference of political interest from the outside as well.
So I want to come back, Professor Zhang. I want to come back to the proposed bill in Congress. It does accuse South Africa of acting inconsistent with its publicly stated policy of non-alignment. Tell us about this doctrine of non-alignment. Would you say South Africa has broken them?
Compared with the NATO, or headed by the United States and the Warsaw organization, and headed by the Soviet Union, the non-alignment policy mainly means to emphasize independence and peaceful coexistence. And so on such a principle, in South Africa choose what was in its national interest. And there was no alliance. First of all, the alliance has a specific strategic goals, strategic goals. South Africa and Russia and China do not have any of such goals, and just quite normal bilateral relations. And on the contrary, the United States, opposition to South Africa's relations with Russia and China is a testament to its alliance, and only allowing oneself to form alliances and opposing the normal relations with other countries, and which is the hegemonic and imperialist mentality also. Now, non-alignment has been mistakenly used, right, and or used by the United States, and it is most suitable for itself, right, to say that only the United States up to now in international affairs is the alignment state or power only, right, alignment leading power.
So, Lawrence, let me rope you in here. Do you feel that this, South Africa has broken that doctrine of non-alignment?
I think that South Africa, represents a unique position and they've made this very clear. The President Cyril Ramaphosa has made this very clear. They, like many of the African leaders, want to work with other nations that will help them and develop them. And this is one of the reasons that China has made so many inroads into Africa, because they're willing to help build infrastructure. So South Africa says we're allowed to have a relationship with China. We're allowed to have a relationship with Russia. And we are historically bound, if given the history of apartheid in South Africa, to bring issues of injustice up into the international court. Now, this legislation in the Congress says, well, if you don't behave the way we want, we're going to have to reconsider USAID shipments to South Africa or other forms of punishment, maybe taking them out of AGOA. And don't forget, this was a stupid move by President Biden when he removed Ethiopia from AGOA during the war. This idea of punishing and sanctioning countries rather than forming working, durable economic relations with those nations shows the arrogance, but the actual idiocy of this new rules-based order. It's not open, it's not democratic, it's controlled from the top, and the U.S. is driving itself into a corner with these policies. And in fact, the global South is now developing and growing and is a viable dynamic in the world, independent of the new rules-based order.
Right. So, Lawrence, I want to come back to the bill again and what the law is proposing, because the congressmen also allege that South Africa has engaged in activities that undermine U.S. national security and U.S. foreign policy interests. So which activities are these that the congressmen are alluding to, and how exactly do they undermine U.S. national security?
Well, first of all, they don't undermine U.S. security. U.S. security is defined wrongly. U.S. security is defined as what benefits this geopolitical faction that believes in a zero-sum game. You're on top or you're on the bottom. Now, what they're accusing South Africa is going back to last year when South Africa had joint maneuvers with the Chinese and the Russians. There were allegations made that they were shipping arms onto Russian ships in the border. And these idiotic congressmen said, oh, no, this is against our interests. Why should we help African countries like South Africa if they're working with other countries in the world? This is the problem. The problem is we're in the greatest crisis in the United States, in my view, since the Civil War. We do not have political leadership that actually understands that development of the world and all the nations in the world is in the U.S. interest. The U.S. defines its interests, and not American interests. I'm an American, and they don't define my interests. But the political faction defines its interest as having countries do what they say, being able to manipulate them and coerce them into their policy. And the United States has foolishly believed that Russia and China have to be put down, have to be suppressed. So South Africa maintains positive relations with those countries, and therefore that's the right thing for South Africa to do. And the U.S. is wrong in this form of attacking South Africa for doing what any normal country should do. And the congressman is rather idiotic in this proposal he's putting before the U.S. Congress. I hope it doesn't get passed. I hope it fails as it should fail. But it's not in the American interest, and it's not really in our security. Our security lies in the development of nations. More people at a higher standard of living involved in new economic growth is the benefit of the United States, and we don't pursue that policy.
All right, very interesting discussion there, but we are going to take a short break. When we come back, we will discuss the Africa policy of the U.S. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Professor 𝐓𝐚𝐥𝐤, Lawrence Freeman, and Gustavo de Carvalho. Before the break, we looked at the proposed U.S. bill. Let's now explore U.S. foreign policy in Africa. Well, Lawrence, you know, last year the U.S. attempted to target Africa as a collective over the Ukraine-Russia war, again through legislation. However, what was called the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act did not pass Congress. Does the U.S. have a fair Africa policy?
To be honest with you, and I've talked to many of my colleagues in this who are specialists in this area, the U.S. has no positive Africa policy. The policy of the United States, which was the unspoken policy at the Africa Summit back in 2022, was to counter China, to stop China. What we saw from the Biden administration this last year is dozens of visits of U.S. officials, including President Biden's wife, to Africa for happy talk and photo ops. There is nothing that the United States is doing to help build up the economies in Africa. Look, Africa has the most poverty in the world. Africa has the least amount of electricity per capita in the world. We should be building infrastructure, electrical plants, hydroelectric plants, nuclear energy, build up these economies. We're doing nothing. So we don't have an Africa policy, and that's one of the unfortunate realities of the situation.
Gustavo, would you say, though, that the U.S., following that malign Russian activities in Africa Act and its response to South Africa as a result of the Israel-Hamas war, would you say that the U.S. is lashing out because it is losing out geopolitically in Africa?
I think the United States face quite a strong risk in terms of the way that it approaches the continent. A couple of years ago, when Secretary of State Blinken announced the new U.S. strategy for Africa, there was some degree of expectations within the continent in terms of what new approach and new narratives the United States would bring. And I think to a large degree there was some excitement with most of the documents, except where it was very clearly stated that one of the objectives of the U.S. strategy for Africa is to counter the influence of China and Russia in the continent. And that brings to policymakers, that brings to the population a large degree of frustration with that, because it feels that Africa is not the focus. Africa is the terrain, is a proxy in a battle that is intrinsically not ours. Mm-hmm. And I think to a certain degree, when bills like this have continuously been presented within the U.S. Congress, it reduces also not only South Africa's but the continent's trust and expectations that it can actually engage with the United States as a reliable partner as well. And I think it is an important lesson for global powers in terms of the risks of instrumentalizing the positioning of the continent in global geopolitical disputes, when in fact I think when we talk about non-alignment positions, and particularly South Africa's one, I think largely what we're talking about is a pursuit of autonomy. It's not just the willingness of making friends on different sides, but rather to build relationships in different parts of the globe, mm-hmm. in a changing global order that has drastically changed the positioning of global powers, that no country has the ability of performing the hegemon role. And for smaller countries like South Africa, it's seen as an important vehicle to strengthen its own capability of navigating the global order.
So let's look at that reliability in partnerships, Professor 𝐤𝐤, because in a sense, the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act, was an attempt to create an East-West divide in Africa, where the United States was sort of saying, you're either with us or you're with them. How counterproductive is this in a globalized world where countries are free to pursue partnerships that benefit them?
Yeah, in the international relations, to pursue the national interest, a very normal thing. It is only because for the U.S. For the U.S. to that means according to the U.S. realistic theory, power means rights. So it is just the U.S. interest in Africa is almost nothing, except countering China and Russia up to now. According to the U.S. Strategy towards Africa that is issued 2 years ago, when the U.S. hired official to visit South Africa, they issued the strategy that is to say, among the 4 major goals of the United States strategy towards Africa, 2 of the goals are against China and Russia interest in Africa. And so it is so clearly that, as has stated by the former president, U.S. President Trump, right? Donald Trump, the U.S. interest in Africa is just at the bottom of the U.S. global strategy. And so by cornering China and Russia at the top of the priority of the U.S. global strategy, and they see where China is in the Africa is the most dangerous thing. And so South Africa in the recent years have very good relations with China. And so, standing for China and Russia in many of the occasions and platforms. And so this is provoked the United States, and so the United States feel angry against the South Africa's policy, and so that's why the U.S. is saying that South Africa's activities has been endangering, right, the U.S. national security.
Right.
This saying is just based on the U.S. global strategy.
So I want to get your final closing thoughts. And as you wind up, Gustavo, I also want you to weigh in on this message that the U.S. is sending South Africa by targeting it as you wind up.
So I think to a certain extent, it's going to be important to see what discussions are going to happen in the U.S. Congress, but also the bilateral discussions that are ongoing between South Africa and the United States. We've just received this week a delegation of congressmen from the U.S., a bipartisan delegation that met with parliamentarians, met with President Ramaphosa. It is important to notice that the U.S.-South Africa relations remains very important. The U.S. is one of the largest trading partners of South Africa, and South Africa remains committed to continue with that bilateral relations. But there is certain compromises that the country would find very hard to do. It will want to maintain a degree of autonomy in the relationships that it builds, considering it has increasingly engaged with countries like China, countries like India as bilateral partners, and particularly when it comes to the issue of the case in the ICJ, especially considering the large amount of support that the country has received by many countries, not only from the global south, but also countries within the global north. It is very unlikely that the country would deviate from that particular position. We've seen South Africa already making some adjustments and course corrections when it comes to its own position on Ukraine, where for at least the first year of the war there was a lot of confusion. But also South Africa has presented itself, for instance, in the case of Ukraine, as a potentially very useful country in the event of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. South Africa has been one of the few countries within the global south that has participated not only bilateral discussions with Russia, but also in the Ukraine peace formulas that have occurred in the last couple of months. And whether we like it or not, at some point negotiations and discussions will have to happen. And countries like South Africa, some of the few countries that are able to bridge and to bring those different parties together.
Professor Zhang, your final comment. How do you see this playing out, and how do you see the U.S. engaging more progressively with Africa?
basically the U.S. is just now worried about losing Africa, and so it is stepping up its efforts to suppress Africa and make Africa try to submit to it. And I think for African countries, the most important is take up its responsibility, especially for the African Union, to try to unite and integrate all the African countries and to make a unique major policy towards the United States and try to make Africa as a whole to talk and negotiate with the United States equally and make their dialogue between each other. And so in the future, and Africa could try to maintain its interests, and not only not country by country, but as a whole. This is crucially important, whether politically or economically. And for example, nowadays, the most serious thing is that the U.S. is trying to divide African continent, divide the African nations. And for example, by using the AGOA, for example, lots of the North African countries and the Central African countries is not being included, and it is imposed the sanctions. They are imposed the sanctions, and for some of the aspects of the bilateral cooperation between African countries and the United States, and has been undermined by some of the sanctions, whether politically or economically. And so the unity or integration in one voice is crucially important for the African countries.
Right. Lawrence, you have the final word.
I would say that what I am looking for, and I'm trying to get my government to do, is to actually have a policy and could join with China on a joint mission to eliminate poverty in Africa, to bring electricity to Africa, to bring in extra infrastructure. Our policy should be, how do we raise the material standard of living of the African population? That's the most serious problem we face, is when the population of Africa goes to 2.5 billion people and 1 billion young people, if these people don't have jobs, if they're not employed, if they're not getting paychecks to raise a family, we're going to have the most serious problem. Africa is going to be the center of commerce and political activity in this century. And the United States has to get rid of this stupid geopolitical ideology and start thinking about how are we going to develop a continent that's going to have 1/4 of the population of the world. And that's the kind of thinking we need. And unfortunately, we don't have that from either the Democratic or Republican Party. But that's what I fight for in Washington, D.C.
All right, gentlemen, very insightful discussion there. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests, 𝐓𝐚𝐥𝐤, Professor and Doctoral Advisor, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Lawrence Freeman, Political and Economic Analyst for Africa, and Gustavo de Cavallo, Senior Researcher, African Governance and Diplomacy, South African Institute of International Affairs. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, it's goodbye for now.